This morning, first for the invitation to be here, and then for you being here. You heard me last night and you came back. That is very encouraging to me, and especially those of you who are visiting, and appreciate you coming and listening. Let me make just a couple of notes. I think I want every lesson to be beneficial for somebody wherever they are in their spiritual status. Brother Tom Holly used to say, still says, I guess, what's good for the disciple is good for the crowd. And I think that's right. But I think that tonight, and maybe even more so tomorrow night, would be valuable for somebody who maybe you've been having Bible discussions with, or maybe you've been talking to, or would like to talk to, and would like to start some conversations. I think tonight and perhaps tomorrow night would be good opportunities. I don't think, I'll try not to be mean anytime, and I think everything that we have to say, I hope, would be a benefit for you and for them. And really the focus tonight and tomorrow night is for the group here, but I think that those would also be conducive to talking to other people as well. I think all of us would recognize that in the world we live in, what we think of, and appropriately so, what we think of as foul language is in abundance. It's amazing to me how much it just seems to just flow from people. We were on an airplane headed to Houston, and we had Lena with us, so she was really little. And the lady that was going to sit right in the row behind us, she was using language. I was like, I didn't even know that those were words, but you could tell from the context that she was saying them, and it was just unbelievable. And then she sees Lena, oh, what a sweet little girl, look at those pretty blue eyes. Then sits down behind us, and I'm glad Lena had little headphones on watching her little cartoon show, and then right at, like, the whole plane flight. And then afterwards, oh, that little girl was so precious. You see, it was almost as if she could just flow in between what I would have thought of as good speech and horrible speech all at one time. I have kids in class, and I don't know if you know a lot about Russellville, but we have a pretty large Hispanic population, and a lot of those kids are learning English. But you know where they're learning it from in a lot of cases. They're learning it from Netflix and other social media. And I coached cross country, and I had a boy, he was a senior, and he was talking to one of my kids, and every other word was not good. Talking to my and I said, Juan, what are you doing? He said, what, Coach? I don't. And I said, those are foul words. And he goes, I didn't know. He was surprised. But it's I'm sure he hears all kinds of words at home, but it's also because what he's taking in from the world around us just uses those words like they're ordinary. I remember talking about some of this, and Leo said, Dad, the boy beside me in school, he uses all kinds of bad words, and he's like, I know they're bad, and I'm not going to use them. And I was like, well, now they're homeschooled, so that if the boy beside him in class is using bad words, we got real trouble. So, I think all of us, no matter what stage in life we are in, I don't know that there's much, I used to watch SportsCenter on ESPN a good bit, and now you can't even watch SportsCenter without people using exclamatory words in bad ways. Well, my question today is, I want to think about why they're bad words. Did we just say that those four letters arranged in that order are unacceptable? Is it just because that they once were, in 1950 these were considered bad words, and that's just the tradition that we've been handed down from our grandparents? Why are they bad? And what makes those letters arranged in that order out of bounds? And I wonder, why be so concerned? Why be so worried about something so small and so picky? Isn't there bigger things for a Christian to be worried about? Aren't there bigger things for a disciple to be concerned about? Why is it such a big deal? Well, that's why I had you turn to Matthew chapter 12 and verse 36. Because of what Jesus has to say. He says in verse 36, but I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. Verse 37 says, for by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. I think that what we need to see in the context of what Jesus is saying, in verse 33 he says that a tree is known by its fruits. The fundamental thing that I want us to see is that our words are not just random syllables that pass out of our mouths. They are reflections of who we are on the inside. Now, I think especially somebody might have questions about words that in certain times and in certain places we would say are appropriate and necessary to use, and then in other places, all of a sudden, they're bad words. Why is that the case? Now, I can't say everything about every specific word. I don't even know all the words that are out there. But I think I can say enough for you to have principles, at least to try to address some of these questions. So, how am I going to approach this? I'm thinking of different groups. I'm thinking of folks who already know the words. There's a number of young people here who know the words, and maybe you're wondering why you can't say them. There's a number of parents here, and maybe you know the words, and you want to be clear with your children about why those aren't the words we use when those questions arise. And I also know, I hope that my children don't even know all the words. I hope they don't know a fraction of them. And your parents may be on the edge of their seats wondering what I'm about to say, but I'm not going to introduce those words, I hope, to your children. I want you to trust me on that, and I've tried to think carefully about how to approach this. Well, if you'll flip over to the book of Ephesians, I think we'll come back to this text a few times throughout the lesson, so this might be a good place to put a marker. In Ephesians chapter 4, and specifically in verse 29, Paul there, writing to the Ephesians, talking about leaving that old Gentile way of life behind, and you have several contrasts here. Don't lie, speak the truth, don't be angry, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Then verse 27, verse 28, don't steal, but work. You have these contrasts, what you shouldn't do and what you should do. And in verse 29, he says, let no unwholesome or let no corrupt word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, or good for the building up what is needed, so that it will give grace to those who hear. In chapter 5, in the same context, in verse 4, he says, don't let these things not proper to be named among you. Verse 4, for nor filthiness or foolish talk, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. So, why would we be concerned? I may say this again depending on the lesson, but I want us to see that no part of our life remains untouched, unchanged, untransformed by the fact we have named Jesus Christ as Lord. I want my commitment to Jesus as King to saturate every aspect of our lives. Earlier this week, I had a chance to be at the leadership camp in Belgrade, and I talked to them about dress, and thinking about dress even for boys, and thinking about covering nakedness and modesty for boys. Why be concerned about dress or the words that we use? Because Jesus is King, and He's not just King over what we do within the boundaries of these walls. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17, Paul said, whatever you do, in, notice, word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord. Think about those words. Whatever, in word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord. What escapes out from under that umbrella? I can't think of anything that escapes from whatever, in word and deed, doing all. It all comes under the reign of Jesus. And so, absolutely, we are a congregation. You are a congregation of Christ that meets in this place. We don't throw that demand for doing everything in the name of the Lord behind when we come through those doors. But we ought not to leave it in here either. We ought to take that with us everywhere we go. In word is what I want to emphasize today, and in deed. It's more than a matter of syllables slipping past our teeth. It's about hearts that are being reflected by our words. So let's consider some bad words and why they are bad. So the first category that I want you to think about would be what we call corrupt words. Maybe that's what we would say would be vulgar language. And just in general, of course, there would be different variations of this, but these are words that maybe are descriptors or defined by private or personal acts, body parts, or materials in a crass and crude way. I want to say that I think those would probably be best described in Ephesians 5 verse 4 that we just read, talking about filthiness or foolish talk or coarse jesting. Let me say here that I don't think that what we're seeing here is just a set of key terms. I think we're talking about a category of talk. And so it may not be that you're using the specific words, but it may be that the line of conversation is in this area. And so I think it would include not just the terms, but the topics and discussed in such a way. So I think sometimes, maybe often, these words are corrupt, vulgar words, and they are used to express anger or frustration. And to some degree, they are determined by the culture around us about which words are obscene references to those things. So you go into a doctor's appointment, they may make references to some of the very same things, but they're going to do so in a clinical, sterile, medical way, which is different than the way that those same topics are talked about in a classroom or on the work site. Right? And interesting to me, a lot of times the distinction between those was the Latin word, the root of that became the proper word, and kind of the English or the German word became kind of the crude word for it. All right. But we all understand that those words also are referencing crude and coarse things. The origin of those words doesn't change what they're trying to convey to someone else. Now, even those who justify their use understand that using them adds a level of shock to their statement. Right? Don't you agree with that? So here's a football coach who says, I've got to use this kind of language with my players. Why? Because he recognizes there's something different about the words that he's using in that way than normal words. And that's one of the great challenges of even watching a football game, right? Doesn't matter who you're pulling for. I'm afraid to say that if you pull for Auburn, maybe that guy reins it in a little bit, but we got other things to deal with there, like the fact he coaches for Auburn. Like that's top of the list. But even those who justify it know that there's a level of shock in using those words. Well, why not use them? Well, I think, first of all, I would say it reveals a low-level concern for what words are supposed to be used for. Remember what we read in Ephesians 4:29. Let no unwholesome, let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but only that which is good for edification, necessary edification, what builds up so that it may impart grace, that it's a gift, that it's a favor to those who hear. I think using this kind of language is a failure to see that we want to use words only that build up and are a gift. And also, I think using this language fails to address the problem that is causing the anger in the first place. So, can anger be addressed? Absolutely. Can frustration be made known? I think so. But how does this help? How is this language a grace? Can we express that we are mad about something that has happened? I think absolutely. But how does this build up when we just throw out these corrupt words, these vulgar words? I think that it shows a lack of capacity to communicate the seriousness of a situation without some kind of artificial enhancement that refers to private and sometimes even vile things. Consider what these words are conveying. In chapter 5 and verse 12 of Ephesians, for it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. Sometimes the corrupt terms that we are using are defined by things that we don't want to even talk about. We don't want to even speak of the things that are being done. And it shows a lack of capacity to recognize that. I want you to think about, with the definition of the words, what so often is being expressed. Someone yells one of these expletives, or they give one of these gestures. Consider and I don't want you to think about these words for too long, but think about what the literal expression of what they are communicating is. they react to an instruction or to guidance or to news with that kind of language, what are they really saying? I think it's horrific if you think about it. And as Christians, we ought to think about it, because there is no unexamined part of our life. Consider what kind of language that you are replacing when you use those kinds of words. Often expressions of frustration like that reflect complete anger or frustration. What about, looking back at 5 verse 4, not filthiness, not foolish talk, not coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. You know, when I would blow up, and I don't use these words, but if I was to blow up with words that are these corrupt, vulgar words, I am in that moment demonstrating anger and frustration and a lack, a failure to be grateful. When my boss at school gives me instructions about what I have to do and I react like that to my coworkers and not with gratitude that somebody is trying to point us in the right direction, or when I react like that to bad news and not with gratitude that I'm in the situation that I am. Now, what about things like patience? What about things like kindness or graciousness? What about forgiveness? Where are those words when we're using these expletives? Where's all of that? And I think we see this all over the place. I keep referencing a ball game, but you watch the quarterback and the receiver was supposed to cut in and he cuts out. And what is the quarterback doing as they're walking to the sideline? Using all sorts of foul language. How much better would it be if that guy put his arm around the other one and say, man, I'm grateful you're here. You're really good. Let's try to work on it this way. You see how he could be building up and he could be giving grace, even in a worldly participation like ball. How much more so in so many of the other aspects of our life with our wives or our children. And you hear people use language with their children that doesn't convey anything about bringing them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, but just expressing the frustration and anger of mom or dad. Now, are there times where we must use words that describe bodily processes and anatomy and talk about what are rightfully only husband and wife interactions? Of course. You know, the Scriptures talk about those things. All of those things in various and different ways. You read through the book of Leviticus, and I don't think there's one aspect of the human body that isn't referenced in some meaningful way. But the Scriptures, even when they talk about those things, I think do so in limited places, in ways that recognize what we were talking about, and I think also in ways that recognizes the private nature of so much of that. You know, when we talk about husband and wife interactions, it often uses very careful and concealing terms. Probably the text that we would think of as the catalog or the definition of what fornication is, Leviticus 18, which I think probably would have been the catalog that Jesus and the apostles would have used as their dictionary for what counted as fornication. Do you know it doesn't say, it uses the phrase uncover the nakedness. Now, I think that conveys exactly what we understand what it's conveying, but that's still maybe what we would think of as a term that's trying to pull back from speaking of this in an open and perverse way. Throughout the Scriptures, the idea of to know is used. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, controlling one's own vessel. I think very likely he's talking about sexual morality in that, and yet he does so, he approaches it in a very, very considerate way. Probably the most open time it speaks of sexual intercourse is in its condemnation of this illicit activity. And in those cases, when the word porneia is used, it's translated fornication, maybe in your text, sexual immorality. I think the New American Standard translates that immorality in some places. That's just bad. Don't read that. I love the New American Standard, just don't use it there, okay? But I think in those situations, what you have is that the seriousness of what's being discussed is not lost, is it? I think we feel the weight of it because of the way that the Bible approaches talking about that thing. When it is opened up, when it does speak more clearly about it, it speaks with it with weight. It is the bold use of those terms, I think, that expresses the seriousness. Let me say this, that there are terms and phrases that are not specifically labeled cuss words that meet specifically the problems that we've been talking about. I have, teenage students every day, and there are words that they can use that are not even on the list of what are considered crude words. But if you think about where those words originate and what they are for and how they are used to communicate, very often. There are new phrases used in my classroom, and I have to use the awful resource called Urban Dictionary. You ever use this? Kids will say a word, and I'll be like, never heard that word used that way. I need to see what's going on here. And you use urbandictionary.com, and you can look up the word, and I have to say, yeah, we don't need to be using that anymore. Well, the other teachers don't have a problem with it. The other teachers don't know what you mean, right? And the other teachers don't have the same approach to language that what we want to be doing is we want to be building up and being gracious. Now, that doesn't mean there's no room for humor. That doesn't mean there's no room for being silly. Less room than they think there is for it, but it doesn't mean there's no room for it. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to use these things that are corrupt and vulgar, and that Jesus specifically draws boundaries around, that Paul, when he's writing to the Ephesians, draws boundaries around. Maybe those words themselves that they're using have another definition, but they're being used in a way to communicate what is crude and what is nasty. I'm not going to specify any of them, but if you're a young person and you have questions about that, I'm happy to address them. Because even if that means having a conversation about the specific word, I think it's valuable for us to say we need a way to measure and evaluate the language that we're using. Let me go to a different idea here. I think the other words that I want to think about are cheapening words. And so the way we might think of those would be profane. So sometimes we use like vulgar language. I think that would basically categorize the corrupt words. And then we talk about using profanity, and I think that is a different category. You can use those words interchangeably. That's fine. I think everybody would know what you mean. But I think that when we talk about cheapening language or profane language, we are talking about words that have a proper usage. But that usage is serious and heavy, and yet those words are often thrown around us as if they have very little value at all. They're often used as expressions of frustration or even surprise. Now, these are words that I get pushback from when I try to correct young people, particularly ones who are not associated with religious situations. And they say, well, you would use that language, or you would say that kind of stuff. Now, often when they say that, I say, you're right. And I use that word in exactly the way that I would use it, because I want them to see the weight of what we're talking about here. Now, when I tell them that, I say, guys, when I use that word, I tremble. Like, I love Mark 16:16, but I tremble when I say, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, he that believeth not shall be damned. I prefer to use an updated translation. I know it means the same thing, but that word just shakes me. Jesus, when he's teaching about hell and eternal separation from God, even when I talk about that in the pulpit, it gives me pause. Not because I'm apologizing for Jesus, but I see the weight of that word and what that means. I will use those terms, and there are places where I think I must use those kind of terms. But if I'm using those words, I hope that the people around me pay serious attention, because they will say, Plyler never uses those words. What is he talking about? If somebody down the hall at school hears me using those words, I hope they take pause and say, something must be wrong. Something must be serious. Because those words are not in my normal vocabulary. I'm not throwing them around like cheap. Now, a regular, frequent, dismissive cheapening of those words can cause not only others, but ourselves to think less seriously about those things. If you are using words that talk about God's condemnation or eternal separation from God, and you use them like some people use and but and because, if you're just throwing them out cheaply, it will not take very long before the use of those words means zero to you. It means nothing. It reflects, I think, using those words like that, I believe reflects a heart that doesn't consider the seriousness and weight and dread of those terms. Now, there are serious terms, and we may make different judgments on how to use certain terms. I heard a Bible teacher not too long ago, and he was teaching through something, and he kept using the word holy, and he would describe cows and mackerels and all kinds of things. And that gave me a lot of pause. Now, maybe you think differently about the word holy because it's not a divine word necessarily. Maybe it's used in other circumstances. But I don't think holiness is an idea to be treated cheaply. I think the language of cursing, or what has been abbreviated to cuss words, I think these terms are expletives of frustration. But I just want you to think, when you call down God's condemnation, right? When you use a word about God's damnation of someone, does that person really mean what they're saying when they say that? Now, they may not. They may not know the full weight of that. But I think if they knew where they stood in relation to the Lord, and I think if they knew what that condemnation meant, I don't think they would use those terms so lightly. And I think certainly we ought not, knowing what that means for the person on the other side. You know, let me just use this example. My parents, when I was growing up, we would be playing a game, and my brothers would, maybe they'd skip a base playing baseball, or, they would do this or that. And they would say, I would say, "You liar." My parents would say, "No." Do you know what happens to liars? We're not throwing around condemnations of lying. Now, maybe they made a mistake, maybe they're not being honest, but we're very careful about what we are accusing other people of. And that's not even a word that we would think of as a curse word. But I think there's a seriousness to the words that we're using. Now, sometimes people don't mean it. They're just throwing around those terms. But I don't think that does any less. In fact, I think it may do more to cheapen what those serious terms really mean. Consider James chapter 3 and verse 10. In a chapter all about the use of the tongue, he says in verse 10, "From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a fountain pour forth from the same opening fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, produce olives, or a vine tree produce figs? Vine produce figs. Nor can salt water produce fresh." I think when we look at James chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, I think the whole chapter of James can apply more broadly to our language. But I think specifically what he's saying here is, imagine someone who uses their mouth to honor God and worship, and then walks out the door and starts calling down condemnation or referring to eternal separation from God, and just throws those words around, and especially throws them around directing them at other people. What does he say? My brothers, these things ought not so to be. That is not the way it ought to be. We ought not to come in here and sing a prayer to God about giving us more holiness, and then walk outside and speak to our brothers or our sisters or even those on the outside and talk about cursing and condemning. Because I'll tell you, a fountain that brings fresh water doesn't bring out bitter. And a vine that produces figs is not going to produce olives, or vice versa. And so if we are using that kind of language, it is because we are a bitter fountain. Because a bitter fountain, there's fresh water that comes out mixed with bitterness. That's what happens. All right. Now, when we talk about using God's name in vain, I think that fits in this category, doesn't it? Cheapening words. We may talk more about this in our next lesson, because I want to talk about the value of the name of God. But I would put in this category taking God's name in vain, using it in cheap ways. I think perhaps this word was probably first, this idea of taking God's name in vain was probably first in reference to swearing on the basis of God's name. And that would be, you make a promise or you make a commitment, and then you put God's name on it, And Jesus is saying, really what you're doing is you're taking God's name in vain. You're using it emptily. There's a book I read lately, and I don't know that I'm completely compelled by this, but I think it's an interesting idea, that the idea of bearing God's name in vain or carrying God's name or taking it in vain is that we wear God's name and then we live lives that don't compute with that. We're not walking worthy of that. And I think that is a way of carrying God's name in vain. I think it's a way of bearing or using God's name in vain. We wear it and then we live lives that look like the world, and we end up making being called by the name of God look useless and vile. This is often not put in the category of bad words, you know. You try to watch children's shows and try to find things that are appropriate for the children to watch, and you say, well, this has a good rating, and it doesn't take very long before terms that are using God's name cheaply are on there. I thought for a long time that maybe HGTV was about the most wholesome show you could watch, right? Here's people working on their own houses and repairing them. Now I think there's all kinds of problems with it. I think it creates envy and covetousness, and I think there's other sinful things that are associated with it, but especially at the reveal. This is the great part of the show, right? They get to see what has been done. You get to see the reveal. And what are they doing? They're throwing God's name around. Now, if in those moments they broke down and said, oh God, I am so thankful for what you have done. Thank you for this provision, and may I use it in hospitality for my friends and neighbors. Then I'm on board. That's not how they do it. They throw God's name around cheaply and lightly. I think that I know these words are not categorized in what we would say are the bad words. But I tell you, I think this is what I'd want to avoid the most. Because I realize that there are boundaries for what are crude and vulgar words. And I realize that there are serious topics. But I do not want to throw the name of my God out in vain. I don't want to use it in an inappropriate, vain, useless way. I think crying out to God is perfectly appropriate. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hands have made. Psalm 8:1, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. In moments of distress, my God, why have you forsaken me? And when we're giving thanks, O Lord, my God, I cried to you for help, and you healed me. Psalm 30, verse 2. When we're seeking rescue, O Lord, my God, in you I have taken refuge. Psalm 7, verse 1. But I never want to use those words out of exasperation or in shallow anger or in dismissive frustration. I want to approach the way I use God's name very carefully. Now, what about euphemisms? Well, I think we want to be careful because of what words mean, not just because of the order that the letters are in. Does that make sense? It is not those four letters arranged in that order that makes them bad. It is those words conveying meaning that makes them bad. Now, I want to be careful because I know that sometimes people use words as euphemisms and have no idea what they mean and maybe don't even know that they are used as a euphemism. Can I use an example? Whenever something bad would happen, I used to yell crikey because I watched Steve Irwin jump on crocodiles and crikey this, you know. But you know that crikey is an Australian euphemism for Christ? I didn't know that either. If you use the word crikey a lot, I'm sorry to inform you of that. But I want to be more careful in the way that I use words like that. Because just because we rearrange or change a couple of letters, if you use those words with the same intention, I don't think we're gaining a lot by shifting them around. Because I do want to say this. I do want to say that I appreciate it that people do make an effort to not use the foulest language possible, right? So let me be gracious in that way and understanding and say, it's better when the receptionist at the dentist office uses euphemisms than using other things. I appreciate that. But I also want my children to avoid using words that just become replacements or substitutes for the bad words, but don't stop reflecting something in their hearts like anger or frustration or foul thinking or other bad attitudes. I want to be careful. because when I hit my thumb with a hammer, something's going to come out. Even if it's just ow, right? It's some word, maybe. But I think that I can deal with that in a way that doesn't bring corrupt language, that doesn't bring cheapening language, and certainly doesn't bring God's name into the situation. So let me ask, can you control your speech? You know, even in James 3, it is described even in the Scriptures as an intense challenge. If you go to the circus, you can't see the elephants anymore. You know, Peter ruined that, but that's okay. But we can control the largest land animal on the planet, make them sit and turn. We can control the most vicious animals, lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. No fill in the blank at the end of that. But our tongue, he says, that is one animal that we hadn't gotten a hold of in James 3. But it's so powerful. It is like a rudder on a ship. It's like a bit in a horse's mouth. It's like a campfire that got out of hand. There is a constant call with the recognition of its power and with its wildness to get a hold of it over and over. Now, maybe that means talking less. I think that's the very idea that James is communicating. That it's not good for everybody to be teachers because not everybody has a control of their tongue. Not everybody has the weight of their tongue considered. And so he says, don't become teachers because you're going to have stricter judgment. Consider the effects of what your tongue can cause, whether it's the words we use or the doctrines that we teach. It can create fire in a moment. But I think probably what it should mean for us, especially people who have been Christians long enough that we ought not to be receiving the milk of the Word, but ought to be teachers of it, as Hebrews 5 would say. For us, I think it means considering in our heart what we want our language to accomplish. And what we want our language to accomplish is we want to be lights. We want to radiate to the world. Our world is given over to complaint and to anger and bitterness and being dismissive of God. And all of that is communicated in their language, isn't it? But we can be light. We can be light by being people who give thanks, who speak of His goodness, who declare His will, and who express the seriousness of things that people treat so cheaply. And we can refrain from bringing corrupt words and concepts into the conversation. We're not going to sing a song right now, but we're going to have about 15 minutes, Lord willing, before we start the next hour. If you've never given your allegiance to Jesus, there are some words I'd love for you to say with sincere meanings. I would love to hear somebody say, I believe that Jesus is the Christ. He's the King. He's the Son of the living God. And I would love to hear Brother Wes say, I'm going to baptize you into the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins. That'd be beautiful. Those are great words to say and to hear. And so if that's the case, if that's where you're standing outside of Christ and you need to make your life right, then that would be wonderful. We're going to pick up at the 11 o'clock hour, and Lord willing, what we'll do is we'll talk about God's name. And we'll do that in some more detail than we did in this lesson. Thank you.